like couldn't be more honored to have Shauna Sever here. This book, Midwest Baking, is just like one of my favorite books right now. I keep going back to it, and I have so many questions just that I'm curious to know. So I hope that it's an informative conversation for you, and we get to learn a little bit more about Shauna's role in this book, and how she came to it, and then everything else that she does, because she does like a million things. So very excited about that. Before we get started, I just wanted to really appreciate again the 4 Leelanau County libraries who have been hosting this. If you've been to one of these events before, you know how much I really love libraries, and they're such community centers, especially as I think we've seen with COVID, and how much we've all missed it when they're not open to the public, and all the work that they've done to pivot to curbside and really continue to be a resource for our communities. So it's just was such a great pleasure that I'm willing, or happy that everyone was willing to come out tonight and support libraries. So thank you for that, and for all the hard work that went into it. And truly, Laura did a lot of the behind the scenes work too. And she's going to be leaving the Leland Library to focus on her family and her kids and other things. And so it's really like extra sad that she's not here tonight, because she was really responsible for a lot of this work. So that's kind of the start to it. And then I also wanted to appreciate Bel Lago Winery. I left the bottle downstairs, but they have done some pairings with each of these courses. And this is the Tempesta, which is one of their red table wines. And, Michigan just has such a diverse amount of agricultural things, and I think my favorite is the wine. And Bel Lago is just making such great wine right now, especially really great reds. That's a little bit rare up in that part of the state. So just thank you to them and to Sarah Peschel for sending those along. And if you're in the area, I know their tasting room is open again. So if you go and check it out, the Tempesta, I highly recommend, especially with these Renzas, which is a little bit hard to see, but I just took mine out of the oven and am so excited to eat it. I've actually had half of one already because I was very hungry before the talk. So for those of you, I think everybody got the recipes in advance, but I was so drawn to this recipe because as a Michigander, I'm so used to having pasties, and this felt like another kind of version of that. And there's a pasty recipe in the book as well, but I was just like, wait, Nebraska has a pasty, but it's a yeasted dough? What is this? So without further ado, I wanted to just kick it over to Shauna, and maybe we can start just by talking about the Renzas, the books, all the things that you do, and really just have some dinner and chat.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so good to see your face. I love your book. I love Grainer Farm. We spend a lot of time in that part of Michigan. We're actually going for 2 weeks, staying in Sawyer in June. It's like, it feels like the finish line after like a crazy year. So we're very excited to get out of here. So maybe I'll have to come find you while I'm up there.
Please.
But yes, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for joining me in my kitchen. As I said, my husband just came home from work and hopefully is taking my children somewhere to feed them. So if you hear any noise or any dogs barking, that's just how things are now. So, but I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So can you've been a part of so many different parts of food media and books specifically. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of origin story of Midwest Made, and how you came to it? What was the first thing that sort of piqued your interest to think like, this is a book I really want to write? Because it's so deeply researched, and it really includes so many parts of the Midwest. I'm curious about kind of how it started for you.
Yeah, so this book, we moved from California. First of all, I should back up a little bit before that. I was born and raised in the Chicago suburbs. I live in Oak Park now, just outside of Chicago. Was born and raised in Illinois. And then after I went to college, got married, my husband and I moved to LA in the early sort of 2000s. And then we moved up to San Francisco too. So all in all, we lived on the West Coast for about 13 years. We had both kids out there. And then in fall of 2015, we suddenly moved back. My husband got a great job opportunity, and we just, I don't know, so all the signs pointed to, time to come home, I guess. And it wasn't something that we anticipated. And when I started my food writing career, it was on the West Coast. It was never anything that I did, growing up here. Of course, I grew up in a very food-centric family, like a lot of food writers do, but food writing as a career wasn't something that really occurred to me until I lived in California, or a few years into living in California, actually. So when we moved home, I had written 3 books at that point, and I knew I wanted to write another one, but I didn't really have a concept for one. And then when I started kind of getting home and eating the foods of the Midwest again, and having a lot of things that I had taken for granted for so long, things that, whether it was family recipes or things in bakeries, and realizing, wow, these are things that I missed, and I think we do that a lot, places that we grow up. We just sort of accept everything as sort of normal, and this is available everywhere, and nothing's interesting to us. But the truth is that there are a lot of things in the Midwest that you don't find anywhere else. And a lot of those things are very delicious, very comforting, and have really deep roots from different parts of the world. And that was something that really got me thinking about this book, was the concept of all of the immigrant influences in the Midwest, and how people came from other parts of the world to settle here, mostly farmers. And that's a group of people that are endlessly fascinating, in that it involves a lot of tradition and practicality and resourcefulness, and using what you have to create something delicious. And it doesn't have to be fancy or over the top to be really special. And those are things I think I have always held really close to me. Maybe it's my Midwesternness, that I didn't even realize that I had, until I came home and started looking at all this food in a much different way. And I thought, oh, this is really kind of a special way of thinking about recipes that's particular to Midwestern people. And so that seed was kind of planted. And then I think it was Toni Morrison that said, if you can't find the book that you want to read, then you have to write it. And so that's kind of what happened. Is I came home and I wanted to just immerse myself in, baking and comfort food of home, and, for my kids and for my family. And to just, it was the first time that we got to actually buy our own home coming back to Chicago. And it's like, to me, I wanted to fire up the oven and bake, and I couldn't find a collection of recipes that sort of encapsulated everything that I wanted it to. Of course, there's a lot of community cookbooks, vintage cookbooks, things like that. Those were a wonderful foundation for all of my research. But yeah, I realized, there are a lot of things that I'm looking for, and there really is no book like this. And that's usually the sign that I have to start kind of developing a book, So yeah.
Well, it is. I was so struck by that because, I'm not, admittedly, I'm not much of a baker. And so I tend to rely on like a handful of recipes and then just pair it with different fruits or things like that. And as I was going through it, I was just like, every single one of these feels like something that is both familiar but also contemporary, because it is different than the like copy of Get Smaltlick that I have from growing up in Holland, Michigan. That's like the truly the like, church basement sort of cookbook. And it felt very relevant, and yet also, there's 2 stories that made me really fall in love with this book. And one was that I was flipping through for this, kind of thinking about this series, and I was like, what would we showcase? It's a baking book, we're getting into fruit season, something like that. And I was like, Dutch letters, what's that? And I like flipped to it, and I always forget to like read the head notes first. Like I always just jump straight to the ingredient list. Right. And so I was looking at the ingredient list, and I was like, oh, this sounds like banquet, which was like in every grocery store and every bakery where I grew up near Holland because of the Dutch influence. And for those of you who haven't had banquet or Dutch letters, apparently it's like a sweetened almond paste in the center wrapped with puff pastry and then baked. And so I was reading it and I was like, oh, this sounds so much like banquette. And I looked at the head note and it was like, oh, this is from a place in Iowa. Some people call it banquette. And I was like, oh my God. And I just felt like so it just, I don't know, it like we use the phrase I felt seen, but I really felt seen. And then at the same time, or like shortly around that same time, my friend Heidi and Molly, who own Field and Florist, a field-to-based company in our area. They do this thing where they bake a cake for each other's birthdays, and so it was Molly's birthday, and I was texting with Heidi, and I was like, "What are you making?" And Molly grew up in Ohio, and so she was like, "Oh, I'm making this cassata cake," and I was like, "I don't know what that is." And then before she had a chance to text me back what it was, I looked it up and it's in the book, and it's like, yeah, this is the Ohio like classic cake. And it was just amazing to me. I don't even have the right words to kind of describe it, but it just felt like these are these deep traditions that people, I never really thought banquette is specific to Holland or apparently Iowa, and kind of how that goes. So how did you find some of those regional specialties and sort of like mix them? Because there's also a lot of your work in it and your family's recipes. And how did you kind of blend those two different elements?
Yeah, it was a long process, right? So I think the foundation for the book and for me to kind of wrap my brain around it and kind of figure out where my voice was going to be in this book. A lot of it had to do with, family recipes. You start with the things you're most familiar and deeply connected to, and then sort of like branch out from there. So it is a balance of, and I'm really flattered that you saw that it is a balance of my personal sort of family recipes and things that I thought would be representative of other states and other areas. And it was kind of like a heavy responsibility. Mm-hmm. So I'm really glad that you saw that, because I really wanted readers to have that feeling of being seen. Like you say that, like it seems like such a like therapy word, like I'm being seen. But that really is what it feels like, because some of these things are so deeply personal to us. Mm-hmm. And how you describe the difference between the Dutch letters and the banquette, it's like, it's just the same thing, it's just in a different form. And I found that there were a lot of recipes that were like that, actually, that are just building block things like a pastry and a filling, but it's a little bit different depending on where you go. And the truth is, a lot of times when you're trying to decide which version of that to use, a lot of times you go with, because I do all the food styling for my books too. So I kind of put that hat on and I'm like, okay, what's going to make the most visual, for the photographs. And so the Dutch letters have that really great shape and they look really unique. And so you choose that. But then the head note is the place to sort of, spell out those other things, because we don't want to forget about people that, have seen it in a different way. I kind of got a little bit off track there with your question, but I think that, oh, sorry. Oh, here's that dog we were talking about. Hey, buddy. Hi. I got a little off track there. Can you help me get back?
Oh, yeah, of course. Well, it's interesting that you say that about the styling of it, because but I mean, banquette is just a log, and I feel like that is like, for better or for worse, sometimes they're in a circle for Christmas, like a wreath, but yeah.
Then it's like a kringle.
Yeah, exactly. So. Yeah. And that's what's so neat about it, is it does feel like there's so many overlapping traditions, but also these really distinct differences. And it is, I guess, to like think through kind of how all of those different traditions come together. It felt, I guess the other thing I was so struck by with it, and is that, again, it was that balance between the homespun recipes, but then also kind of doing this thing that was very community based, because I think what it does is it really strikes this balance between not playing into the like softness of the perception of Midwestern culture, if that makes sense. And I mean, you having been on the West Coast now, I didn't really fully internalize sort of the perception of the Midwest until really traveling to the coast. And I was like, oh, people really do think that this is flyover country and that this is like not someplace with traditions that aren't like weird jello molds with like cottage cheese in them, you know, which I mean, lime jello with cottage cheese is like weirdly delicious, but it's not like the height of our culinary like repertoire, you know. And so I guess I was thinking about that and just wondering like kind of how you brought those together and didn't make it like, how do I say this without offending other people? I feel like there are some cookbook writers out there that it's like, my grandma did this and it was great. And it's like, that's wonderful. But a lot of people have grandmothers, and what else is there? And I felt like, again, this is like kind of me being mean, but you know, I just felt like there was such depth to that, and wondering kind of where that research took place.
Yeah, so I think what you're describing, or at least what I'm hearing, is how do you take something that so many people have a preconceived notion about it, and how do you get rid of anything that sounds like a cliche? Like, how do you get rid of, you know, or not to get rid of, that's the thing, is I didn't want to get rid of a red jello mold with some sort of white cream, because that's one of the first tastes a lot of us remember having, and that's really important, right? So I very early on tried to figure out, how am I going to pay respect to this place that I'm from through the food without falling back on all of these, you know, like tropes, you know, like falling back into these crutches of things, you know. And I knew going in that because I think there's plenty of great resources for this in community cookbooks and online. So nobody needs cake mix recipes from me. Nobody needs anything with Cool Whip or Jello. If you're going to make that, you've already got that. And you're going to, and believe me, I did. When I was pregnant, both times, made all the Cool Whip things that I craved. It has a moment. But if you're going to make a book that people are going to pay the money they work really hard to earn, like, I've got to give you something different, right? So something I did early on that I think was a really great thing that I don't even remember how this first struck me, but it was very early on in the proposal, actually, because I knew when I wrote the book proposal that most publishers are going to be on the coast, primarily the East Coast. And so how are you from the get-go going to take these East Coast publishing people and have them not see flyover country, right? So that's when I came up with the 5 tenets of Midwestern baking. And I came up with those very early in the proposal. And these became sort of my guideposts. These became my very sort of quick and easy way to define for myself what was going to fit in the book and what was going to define Midwestern baking for me. And that's a little light. It's actually on the back cover. It's the bake big, bake easy, bake with purpose, bake from the past, and bake in the present. And I feel like any great Midwestern recipe is going to do all of those things sort of simultaneously. You know, we're not baking for 1 or 2. You know, we're always going to grab the 9x13. You know what I mean? It's got to be easy. And if it's not going to be easy, and there are a few things in the book, and the Cleveland Casada cake is one of them, where it is a multi-step, multi-element recipe. That's in the special occasion cakes chapter. I realized people are going to make that cake maybe once a year. And so that becomes about structuring the recipe so that you can do that over a couple of days, right? You can make the custard, throw it in the fridge. You can macerate the fruit. You can bake the cakes and wrap them, and then assemble it all, you know, the day that you're going to serve it. And it becomes very doable. So those recipes that weren't dead simple for a weekday had to be sort of structured in a way that they could be managed in a very like practical way. The baking with purpose to me was interesting because, you know, I always say that we have to cook, but we get to bake, right? Like, we have to cook every day so we can feed ourselves, we can feed our kids. But baking is always going to be that little button on a day that makes it special. It's not ever something that we have to do in order to survive, right? And I recognize that that's something unique about the sort of category of books and recipes that I've chosen to do. That's kind of what draws me to baking, is that we don't have to do it. So in the baking with purpose, You know, that was something when I was trying to figure out whether or not the recipe had a place in a book. I mean, the purpose can be anything from like a weeknight craving to a special occasion or a birthday, you know, but there's always going to be a reason why you have that sort of thing. And then the baking from the past and the baking from the present is kind of what you talked about, where we really love old recipes, family recipes, traditional recipes. The deeper the roots, the better. But I think something that Midwesterners are very open to in a way that maybe other people aren't is that we really prize innovation, and we really love when someone can tell us how they made something and give us like a little trick or a tip that they did to sort of make it fresher or quicker or whatever it is, right? And to me, that's the baking in the present. That could be anything from you know, some of the older recipes in the book that just had tons and tons of sugar, and like that's not really our palate anymore. We kind of like our desserts with a little bit of salt or a little bit of acid. We want things to be balanced now, you know. It's not enough anymore just to throw a bunch of sugar into a cake and call it dessert, right? So there are those elements of modernizing things as well in terms of the technique or the flavor. So that's where the baking in the present is. And if a recipe checked all 5 of those, then it definitely went in the book.
Yeah, that's so interesting about modernizing the palate, because it makes me think about, you know, again, to that immigrant and farmer culture, that so much of this food, and I think this is true in the South as well, is it's food of sustenance, because you're working such a physical job, so many hours out of the day. And it was interesting. Our former neighbor, my former neighbor up north, Gene Garthy, is a legacy cherry grower up there, and he would talk about, or maybe Kathy, his wife, was telling me about how, because they live in the original Garthy homestead, and just like during cherry harvest, you know, there were 3 people who would make all the food, because that was before machine harvesting, you know, in his grandfather's time. And so there would always be these giant spreads, and there'd always be all these pies. And it's funny because I was just like, who has time in July to, like, you know, make 10 pies for this like crew or whatever? But it did feel like it was just sort of a different time, and that's what you were doing, and there was just more hands or you know, whatever, more kids around, whatever. But it makes me think too, like that sort of drop, how that affects the palate itself. And so what were some of those hallmarks of the like kind of modernization of some of these recipes? And I have something about the renzas too when you're done, but I'm curious about kind of what you saw most regularly and how they got adapted.
Yeah, I mean, right out of the gate, like what I just said was really the amounts of sugar that you would find in old school recipes was pretty shocking. And I'm not at all someone who you know, is going to trim sugar just for sugar's sake. So a lot of times I would, you know, test it, and then, you know, your instinct as a baker is you're like, yes, I didn't really need quite that much, and you can trim it back, you know, and any chance that I could, I would do that. But of course, you don't want it to affect the outcome. And sugar does so many things in a recipe. It is not just a sweetener, right? It, depending on the recipe, it can perform as a liquid. You know, it gives texture. It aerates. If you're whipping it in with fat, if you're doing a cake with the creaming method, you know, you'll end up with a flat cake if you don't have enough sugar to get in there and aerate fat. So it depended on the recipe if I could actually cut the sugar back without it being just really depressing. But I think other things were also the salt. I have always believed that if you add a little extra salt and a little extra vanilla extract to anything, it gives it that, it makes it sing a little bit more, because especially with fruit desserts or chocolate, you know, vanilla is always just going to add that sort of roundness and that really sort of beautiful thing you can't put your finger on. So those are always 2 really good ideas. And yeah, like I said, acid as well, you know, is something that I don't think our grandmothers really thought about as much, you know, consciously. Just the way that you are a savory cook, and like the amazing things that you do with vegetables. I mean, all of those same things apply to fruits, you know, or nuts, or, you know, whatever sort of thing you're trying to play up. It's like a little orchestra. So there are certain aspects of baking that are chemistry, that are just science, that you really cannot stray from. But I think any time that you could sort of play with flavor, it was really fun. And a good example of that, I think, the cassata cake is one where, there's a little bit of balsamic vinegar in those strawberries. And you don't taste them vinegary. When I lived in California, of course, you could get red all the way through strawberries in February, all year. It's just, there's nothing sadder than bringing a toddler from California to Illinois in the fall, because all toddlers want are berries and avocados. And so those are the two things I probably miss the most, in addition to my
get used to eating apples, kid.
Right, yeah. And that's a whole other thing, right? It's like those cold storage fruits that are going to be good all year round. I mean, those show up in the book plenty. But in the case of those strawberries in the cassata cake, I mean, you add a little bit of sugar and a little bit of vinegar, and any sort of slightly mealy strawberry will taste really great, right?
Well, and that's interesting, because I saw that in the recipe and I wondered about that, if it was like something that you chose to do as a recipe developer, not knowing what type of strawberries people were going to get, and making it a bit more foolproof for like if someone's going to make it in February or January or something like that, or so kind of how that played in. So how much does the executability in a home kitchen affect how you're thinking about some of those steps?
It's absolutely everything. And I think maybe my sort of insecurity I had of not being a classically trained pastry chef has sort of lessened over the years, because I realized that my deep sort of connection to home cooks and home bakers is something that works really well when you're writing cookbooks. Because I'm always thinking about what's, my friend and I always laugh, because we always, anytime someone asks you to do an assignment, they want you to give tips and hacks. What are your hacks? What are your 5 hacks? And then you're like, oh, these hacks. But people really, they need a good hack. And in the case of like those strawberries, if I just told you that will work with any recipe, a dash of vinegar and a little bit of sugar. That's a trick that you can use in fruit salads. You know what I mean? Like, so I do think about those things a lot. And I wish I could be one of those sort of people that just does things without kind of overanalyzing it, but I'm really not that person. So anything that's in there like that, it does sort of make your editor a little bit crazy, because it adds text, and they never like anything that's going to add text. But I really do try and choose the tips for recipes that are going to apply to multiple sort of things, and kind of empower people to bake better, across the board.
Well, and just, I mean, thank goodness you're someone who like analyzes all of those things, because even I was trying so hard to follow the recipes, and it's just not in my nature. And so like, I was just like, no, don't do it, Abra. And like, even with the cassata cake, I was like, ooh, I have some pastry cream, weirdly enough, already in my fridge. I can just use that up and like, and I was like, no, don't do it.
You could have, it was a pretty basic pastry cream, but
it also just felt like this is the thing, is like, and that's where I learned from other folks too, or even with the renzas I was thinking about too. Like, so I did the cabbage, but then I had this sauerkraut, and I think I was struck by the alternative name being Krautburger, and I think it like stuck in my head, and so I just added the sauerkraut to it, and then like was like, oh, what else do I have in the fridge that I can like throw in here? And I had some like roasted asparagus, and I was like, no, Abra, follow the recipe. And I was like, I'm gonna do the sauerkraut, because it reminded me so much of I was thinking about those strawberries and that little bit of acid. And there's a recipe that I remember reading ages ago, from a northern Italian meatball that has pickles ground in with the ground meat, and it's such a simple thing. It doesn't taste like pickles, but it just really, it like makes it feel very light and fresh. And it's just all of those little things. It's so hard in a cookbook to express like when you can add those things, but then also try to think through how you draw those connections for people of like you were saying about the vinegar and the sugar for any fruit. Like Yeah, you can use that in fruit salad. You could also use it with any type of berry, so like I was thinking like this cassata cake would be so nice with raspberries too, or any other sort of
Oh
like
yeah.
fruit like that. But it's, yeah, otherwise they just become such sort of long-winded tools. Did you have like struggles with your editor for like bringing those things down a little bit or more of them, or how did that kind of go for you?
Well, I always try and choose, what's going to go in the method itself, because when you're talking about text or real estate within the book, like let me see if I can find like a good example. So what I try to do when I was writing this book, I knew that there were things I wanted to say more about. And those are the things that are, kind of more essay style that take up a full page. Like here, where I talk about Chicago style cheesecake, because I'm a big food history nerd. And so those were places where I could expound a little bit more on that. But if I was talking about, like the tips and the hacks that we were talking about, sometimes it has a place if it flows really well with the head note. You can kind of flow it in with the head note, but there's always these little areas that you can do a call out or a tip, and it'll be, a sidebar type thing. And so when I'm writing a recipe, I try and think like, okay, what can actually take up space in the head note? What can I sort of talk to the designer and kind of, shrink stuff down and make those sort of suggestions and requests, and then, it's all kind of different. I hate sort of leaving a tip out that I think could really sort of make it easier or better. And I think that those are the sort of things too that make people feel like they're in the kitchen with the author and they're not just reading a random recipe off the internet, and I think that if people are going to invest in a book and that hopefully they'll bake from again and again, you have to kind of give them a sense of what your voice is like as an author and what's important to you and what you want them to know. And so as you can tell, I don't have a problem with talking. And it's like that with when I'm baking in the kitchen too, like I talk to myself all the time, like my kids are totally used to it. But if I'm doing something and I'm like, oh, I want to add the, whatever. I always have my legal pads. I have a million. That's my big system, is my like piles of legal pads. And I'll always write that down because if I'm talking my way through a recipe and I'm talking to myself, even if I sound kind of nuts, it's just a way of processing it. What would I tell somebody if they were baking right next to me at my counter? Be like, this is why I'm doing that. And I do think people appreciate that. I get a lot of emails about that, and I get emails about that after I do, on camera stuff too. It's like people go, oh, you always tell us why you're doing something, because I think that is the difference. If you're going to do a bound recipe collection and actually sell it, gives people more than just directions, a list of ingredients. Yeah.
And that's a really perfect segue, I think, to just talking about some of the other work that you do. And I know you most from Splendid Table because we're a big NPR family over here, and I was just curious about how the pandemic has affected how radio works, how these other forms of media have worked, and kind of what some of those transitions have been like for you.
Yeah, it's been a lot of this. It's been a lot of a lot of Zoom, a lot of virtual events. But to be honest, for me, I've loved it because like these faces that we're seeing here tonight, and not everybody is from right around where you are. I mean, you can put a link out on Instagram and you can get people from all over the world. Well, people are probably asleep right now, but you know what I mean? You can reach out to so many more people than you could before. So on the virtual event side, that's been really great. As far as radio goes, I mean, it's been really tough because people, they shrink their budgets and they can't, pay extra contributors, or they want to restructure. And so that's, what's happened all across media, or doing things like the Today Show. I have a friend who is New York based still, and so she'll do everything from her home and she can still be on regularly. But for someone like me, I just kind of have to decide, like, what can I do that's not going to disrupt my family. And the past year it's been crazy. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I had planned for, well, it was a year ago now. I mean, it just disappeared into the ether. I mean, when you have a book that comes out, so this was fall 2019, this Midwest Made came out. So then you do a rush of press in the fall and holiday to like push the book for those sales. And then you take a break. And then I had stuff scheduled all, February through summer of last year, all summer planned, and all that stuff. If it's live events or if you have to travel, and it all just kind of disappeared. But it's interesting, I mean, some of it has changed. I've done a lot of podcast interview. I mean, that can all be done remotely still, which is great. But I think it's been a really interesting time to kind of actually step back and process what I've done with this book. And I think I'm somebody who always, maybe I would have put this book out and then immediately think I have to start writing another one. And I think a lesson I really learned the past year has been that if you're a creative person who feels like you need to be producing in order to be worthy or have your work validated, this has really shown me that like the opposite is true. That the biggest part of when you produce something like this, that I put so much of myself into this book, that it would have been a shame to just move on to the next thing. So it has forced me to very lovingly sort of put this book out into the world and do, more virtual events or more social media things than I might have normally before moving on to the next thing, So that's been a really great thing, actually, is just to, what's the term in literature about like the hero story, like someone getting the prize or the whatever it is, and then they have to bring it home. You have to bring, the hero has to return home and, show what you've done. And so that's been a big shift for me, like the mind shift, just slowing down and being like, no, you kind of put everything that you had into this book, like sit with it for a minute, like no, don't rush to the next thing, but that's that's a bigger discussion about culture than anything else.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that it does feel like that is, epitomizes some of these other conversations that I feel like we're having as a society about taking that time to move a little slower, and like, what are the things that we're going to take out of this pandemic that we want, that we actually liked. I mean, aside from, massive death and destruction, and the loss that has come with it, like, is there something that we've learned about ourselves outside of just grieving, that we can take and apply forward? And the events that when they got canceled, you were like, oh gosh, I didn't want to do that anyway, and it's like, then why did I say yes, and or I want to visit with all of these people, but if I do 3 visits a day, now that we can all be together, if we're being safe about it, I'm not actually going to be fully there, and I wonder, it sounds like you're feeling that both with the creative process and with work, but I wonder if you're seeing that show up in how people are cooking now, or if you're seeing something as, an active part of food media that's being reflected with that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing has really been that people have given themselves so much grace as far as what their idea of kind of what's worthy of putting on the table, or what's worthy of sharing with each other. I mean, I'm somebody who, if I love to have people over to the house, but it's like, oh, I got to clean the house, and then I got to make this thing, and it's got to be right, and it's got to be, and now I just want to like send people over and like you can put out a box of crackers and some cheese and just like, and not have to make a thing of it. I mean, I think as food media exploded, and particularly the visual aspect of it with, like Instagram, and we're just like inundated with everybody's, perfect party pictures, and it whether or not we realize it, it can make us all feel a little bit less than, or what we should be doing, or like I said, I realized for so many years I was like shoulding all over myself, like I really should, whether it was work or for my family or whatever it is, and the shoulding is horrible because you forget, you know, what the actual, you know, the roots of it or the importance of it is. So I think that's something that's really changed, is I think that when people can get back together, we're going to be so much happier with so much less. And I think that that's really great. And I think something that I've gotten a lot of feedback with from this book is like the simplicity of the recipes, you know, and just sort of the humble quality that a lot of these things have. And, you know, in the introduction to the book, I talked about the thing I realized that I love the most about the Midwest and Midwestern people is sort of this concept of this dull shine, which sounded like a downer. And I remember going to my editor and my agent being like, this looks like the absolute wrong thing to say. But my point is, you know, dull shine in that you don't have to make it the fanciest thing. You don't have to try so hard. You don't get any extra credit in life by, you know, like making every single thing from scratch and, you know, blowing people's minds every time. It's really more just about, you know, being there and sort of your intention of doing something. And to me, the dull shine also is, you know, about a patina, about a real sort of treasuring of sort of tradition and things being done the same over time. You don't have to pull a new rabbit out of the hat every single time for it to be special, you know?
Well,
So.
and there's nothing more exhausting than going to someone's house for dinner and having to like listen through the sourcing Olympics or like get some sort of food history on like every single dip that's on the table. It's like, I don't know, maybe again, I'm a little bit of a grouch sometimes, but it's just like, we're here to talk to each other. And if the host isn't comfortable, you know, because there's so many things going on, or they have all those shoulds, but also when it's like, oh, you don't have yuzu vinegar, like gastrique in your cupboard. Ooh, you know, it's just like, who does that? Like, why would you make me feel that way? Like, no, I don't. And, you know, I've got like apple cider vinegar in my cupboard, you know, and I think it's true. And it's interesting because I think a lot about, one of the things I was so struck by when I was writing Roughage and having the recipe tested is the number of people who would reach out and be like, I must have done it wrong, you know, because it didn't turn out. And I was like, and it happened so frequently, you know, that there were all of these questions that I was recognizing the deficiency that I was putting on the page. But I was like, why would you assume that it's you? Like, I wrote this on like my couch, you know, and I was like, oh, this should work. And it's like, I think, you know, and I did a once over with it, but like I said, I'm terrible at following even my own recipe to a T. And so, you know, that's why it was so important. But just realizing there's this huge amount of authority that home cooks have either ceded or had taken from them by the advent of, I think, the, you know, Food Network celebrity chef culture. And that if you're not like salt baying salt from across the room, it's like not good enough. But I hadn't really thought about how much social media plays into that too. And this idea of like, and maybe it's because because you work with food and food media, you probably recognize those profiles where you're like, none of this was done in a home kitchen. You know, this is all studio shots. But it's all of the captions are meant to sound like it's a home kitchen, you know, and it's just like, nobody can do that. And even when Shauna already knows this, but I've been very behind the last couple of days. And so I was like frantically getting these renzas done before this. And I was trying to take photos to post them to Instagram. And I was like, I can't like make this look good. And it's like, I'm in the oven, like trying to do it or whatever. And it's like, but that's not what it's about too. But it's so, even now I haven't posted any yet because I ran out of time, but also because I was just like, oh, I should try to like doctor this up. And even that feels problematic. Like, do you see a way out of that hole for a lot of us?
I think
it's kind of a big question.
Well, for me, no, I love that. This is what I've spent, you know, the whole year thinking about. It's, you know, what am I going to do differently and what am I going to let go of? And I think, you know, it's funny. I said this in an interview the other day where I then had to apologize for oversharing. So sorry about that. But I think something that I realized is that, you know, because I have been writing books. I think my first book came out in 2012, but I had been writing online before that, and I had had a career in television before that. And I think that I I realized that I had been working for 10 plus years to essentially try and put myself in a box. Like, and you mentioned this Food Network thing, right? Because I am of an age where I was starting my home, being married, being domestic, whatever you want to call it, in the early 2000s, early mid 2000s, when, you know, Rachel Ray was the big star, and they were coming out with these personalities that were like very, you know, branded, like you know, it was a branded thing. And now, of course, we talk about personal brand all the time. It's become kind of, unfortunately, like a thing. And people try and figure out, okay, here's what I am, so that I'm easily digestible in these little squares online. And then that will grow my following because everyone knows what to come to me for and all this stuff. And I had tried to do that so many times. And I had tried to sort of set a goal for myself where I thought I want to achieve these things or write these things. And then when I get to that point, like everything will be clear because I'll have this like really defined personal brand, and that somehow it would be easier because then all the questions would be answered for me, like what I was supposed to do next. And the thing that I've learned is that the box really sucks because I have some friends that are in the box, and there's a lot of stuff they can't say, they can't express. They can't get on a Zoom meeting like this and tell you they were trying to put themselves in a box for 10 years. Like it's not allowed, right? You have to go on and look like you love the box. And the thing that's funny about me is that I have never been that person. And I don't know why I suddenly thought I would be happy living that sort of life. And that was definitely, you know, not the case. And, you know, writing this book, which is so close to who I am, obviously, basically my life in between two covers, and the lives of a lot of other people too. And I think I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to write a book that has so much of my own personality in it. And I think that the temptation is to say, well, you know, you have this book this is Midwest baking, and that's who you are, and that's what you do, and then you're going to be this person, you know. And that is something for me that I can very happily be attached to that for the rest of my life. That feels really comfortable and great. So in that sense, I'm very grateful that this book found me and vice versa, because this is something that I will always be proud of, will be evergreen, reflective of who I am. But I think the thing that gets really difficult is then the pressure of like the next steps that you want to take, that people come at you and say, oh, then you're going to do a show, and then all your recipes have to be like this, and, you know, whatever else. And that's yet to be seen. I mean, I'm still a relatively young person. I've got a lot of other things to do. And so I'll see how it unfolds. But I think the very long answer to your short question is just that I think that that's the thing that I've really found is it's just like, you know, it's the people that have kind of put themselves in those boxes, you know, when you're faced with something where all the opportunities and the events and the going and the doing is taken away from you.
Right.
You sit with.
And it's so interesting because I was
let my annoying cat out. I don't know if you can hear my annoying cat, but I'm gonna. So sorry.
No, not at all.
I can hear you.
I was just thinking about, you know, talking to someone who has a very successful show and asking, like, you know, she was kind of saying, like, it's hard for me to go out to eat now, you know, because it's that same culture of celebrity, you know, that people we hear about with musicians or TV people or whatever. And I was like, well, would you do this again? She was like, honestly, I don't know if I would, but that's not the choice that I made. And so it's not the choices that I have going forward. And I do think I think we're entering a really interesting time. And maybe I'm biased by the sheer volume of people who have been so dedicated to the restaurant industry, who are just like, I'm out. This is not this isn't sustainable for me. And I think that we're in this really interesting moment of being able to kind of wrestle that narrative back. And because I think I hope one of the things that comes out of the pandemic is sort of a disdain for superficiality, because like at this point, you know, we don't really need it. And also it gives, I think it is what you're saying of like forcing people down this path to like live out this caricature. And I think that that's such an exciting time, you know, and I feel, I knew I liked you, but when you said, you know, shooting all over yourself, that was one of my mom's like famous sayings.
Oh
One of
yeah.
the few that's like edible or like sayable to a library crowd, is, you know, woulda, coulda, shoulda, you'll should all over yourself. And I was just like, it's the best, you know. And I think that there's all of these ways that we box ourselves in. And I think that there's this space right now. And I'm just like so thrilled that you're thinking about that, because this book is so smart. You're clearly so smart and so thoughtful about it. And I think that it's also just encouraging people to embrace what they can do. And like I said, I am not a gifted baker. And even as I was assembling the runzas, I was like, I don't think this is the right shape, because I think it's supposed to be like a half moon and pressed over, but I had used a bit too much flour, so they weren't sealing, and I like didn't have time to make an egg wash to like seal it or whatever. So I just like folded it over and then tucked the edges and baked them seam side down. And they're great. I mean, you can see the like little marks or whatever, but they held together great, you know, and it's just like, oh yeah, these are doable things. And I feel like, I mean, I don't know, there's a lot of health and wellness stuff out there and, you know, healthfulness. But I
Mhm.
think food media has space to kind of be a bit more encouraging. And I certainly find that in your work. So I'm just like so grateful for it. But
Thank you so much. That's so sweet. And especially coming from you, I think our sensibility is really um, very similar. So I really appreciate that. And of course, you can make franzas. Everything in here, you know, is supposed to be very simple and very doable, and it doesn't have to be perfect to be delicious. You
Well,
know.
and I think it's mostly a dough thing. I feel really comfortable with butter-based doughs. Like I feel like I finally internalized the difference between like a short crust, a flaky crust, a puff crust, you know, like I get that and how that butter works. But with yeasted doughs, it still is like a little bit of a trick to me. And I actually do have a very practical question. So I baked all of the renza because I chickened out on doing a test of freezing them
Mhm.
before they're baking. Do you have advice for a yeasted dough if I want to make the full batch but don't need all 12? Should I freeze them before they're baked or freeze them after they're baked?
Freeze them before they're baked, and I know that there are a number of people who have done this, and they have had great results with it.
Okay.
And we did it during testing too, and it's the most wonderful thing that you can do for your future self. You open the freezer when you're exhausted and you're like, thank you, Beth, Shauna, I appreciate you.
Yeah.
It is a good feeling. And basically what you want to do, and this goes for any yeasted dough. So you kind of want to, if it's one of those things where you have to kind of give it a second rise,
Mm,
because the runzas is this, if you can refresh my memory for me,
sure.
because it has been a minute since I did, is that one with a second rise where you let it get a little bit puffy before you bake again? Or
No,
they,
I was surprised that it doesn't. So it has two proofs. You mix it, proof for half an hour, punch it down, proof for half an hour, and then shape it, fill them, and then straight into the oven.
bake them right away. Okay, great. So that's exactly, so basically you would shape and then
Okay.
freeze right away, bake from
From
frozen, but you
frozen.
need to add time. I think someone told me they added maybe like 10 minutes or something like
Oh,
that
okay.
to the frozen ones. If you're going to freeze a yeasted dough that needs to, and a lot of German baked goods are like this, where they want you to do just one more quick little proof before you
Sure.
bake it, so it looks really alive again.
Mhm.
Then in that case, you would kind of want to thaw, let it
And let it
kind
go.
of poof a little bit and go. But yeah, these runzas you can bake from frozen.
Okay.
Any sort of sweet rolls or anything like the 5 spice sweet rolls, I'll do those the night before. Those are great to put in the fridge, like
Mm,
shape them, put them in the pan, and then when you take them out the next day, just let them come to room temperature, get a little bit puffy again
okay.
before you throw them in the oven. Yeah.
Right. Oh,
So,
awesome.
but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I'm sure I'll just keep emailing you with my questions as I move through the book. But I didn't know if you knew you were signing up for my personal helpline, but yeah,
I would
definitely.
love to hear from you whenever you want to send me an email. I
Great.
would love
Well,
that.
vice versa. Anytime you're like, I've got this weird vegetable, I'll be like, I don't know, chuck it in the oven, see what happens.
I need some vegetable help. I love your book, but every year I say I'm gonna go to the farmer's market every week. Maybe this summer will be the summer that I do that.
Well, the Oak Park Farmers Market, you just have donuts. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there, but all I ever seem to get are donuts there, because those donuts are so good.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to a summer this year where we can go out and do more things like that. I really did miss that last year, but that's what was great about going to Michigan too. Like it's so beautiful in the summer, and all the farm stands that are there are just stunning. How much you can get for so cheap is amazing. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Mm-hmm.
Well, can't wait to have you back, and we will plan an event at Grainer, and so I can ask you all my questions in person, cooking together, hopefully someday. But thank you so much for taking the time and being with us, and for being our series finale for this series, and just really wonderful. I did want to mention to everyone, again, Midwest Made. Shauna sent a bunch of signed book plates to the Cottage Bookshop in Glen Arbor. So if you go to get a copy from there, they will have signed book plates for you there. And otherwise it's available.
You could also call, if you order it online from them. It's Laura from Leland Library. Hi.
Hey, Laura.
I'm like, who is that?
If you're not in Leelanau County and you want to order the book, he'll happily send it anywhere anywhere. With
perfect.
Signed book plates. You don't have to actually go into the shop. I currently have Leland Township Library's copy.
I love it.
But it'll be back soon. I don't know if you guys got to talk about this, but what I love, it just seems like there's so much love in this book, Shauna. Like that's what I really love. And we just got it, but it would have been such a great book also to do during COVID, because there's just so many happy things in here to make.
Thank you. And I think that was something that was a really unexpected, just wonderful surprise about the pandemic and people being stuck at home, is that anybody who was gifted this book for the holidays actually started baking from it, and how many, I mean, I know I have way too many cookbooks that I've never even cracked open. And I think it was a really wonderful chance for people to sort of hunker down and bake. And I think there are a few things in there that sort of went, I don't want to say viral because it's a weird word when you're talking about COVID. But there were things that, got a little bit more attention, and they gave people some confidence, and they tried all kinds of things. So it's definitely been wonderful to see repeat bakers, people making multiple things from the book. Has been really fun.
Or the through line now between my children and my grandparents' generation, the things that my grandparents would have made. Now there's a through line, and I can make them. I have a recipe to now make them with my children.
I'm so glad that you said that, because that was actually something that I really wanted to write this book for, because I wanted, and I said this in the book, is that I wanted to create a book, an heirloom recipe collection, essentially, for my kids, so that they never felt like they had to leave to appreciate it the way that I did. And I think that I've managed to accomplish that with all of the random things I tell them about every single thing. They can never just have a cookie without knowing the roots of it, which, for better or worse. But, the travel aspect of the book was really wonderful too. And getting, and this kind of, I know we're wrapping up, but it does make me think of one of the first questions you asked, which is, where did you find some of these things? And the truth is that a lot of it was going on these trips in search of one thing. Like when I went to Pella, Iowa to go to the Arsma Bakery, where they're famous for their Dutch letters. And on that trip, talking to every, diner, restaurant server, every person at a gas station, every person, in line at that bakery, what else do I need to eat? And when you ask people about where they're from and what, it's what you said, it's like you feel seen. And when people found out I was writing a book about these things, they're like, you're putting Dutch letters in a book? It's like, yeah, man, there's a lot of stuff in this book. And then they're like, oh, well, you got to go see this and this and this. And it's really exciting. So, I mean, there were a number of things in this book that were not on my original recipe list, that were just sort of gathered along the road from other people, or they give you a seed of an idea and then you start digging more. So I mean, that's really been the greatest thing. And I hope that people get that from this book, is that if there is a sense of community in the book, it's because there were a lot of people that, you know, really gave me their tips and hacks, their favorite things, you know?
Yeah.
So it's not just me. I know my name is on the cover, but you know.
It's only because they run out of space. You know, I feel this way too. There's so many people that contribute to a book, you know, but it's like, it also takes a project manager to pull it all together and to organize it and bring it to life. And I think you've done that really well. So, you know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. It means a lot coming from a Michigan person.
Well, I appreciate that. And I just wanted to say, as we're like wrapping up, thank you again. And thank you so much to the Leelanau County Libraries and to Laura Tui for really, you know, being the spark that started this series, you know, back in February and kept it going, and, you know, has a lot of ideas for how we can continue to grow it in the fall. So we're just like so grateful for her involvement, and for Mark, who's been, you know, really running the behind the scenes thing too this whole time. So and thanks for everybody else who comes to them, because otherwise, I mean, then it actually is just dinner with friends where it's like, these are the people I want to talk to. So I appreciate that everybody else has been a part of it. But, yeah.
Well, we all want to talk to you, so that makes it easy to say yes. You get those emails where you're like, yes, I will talk to you. That's a yes. That's not a should. That is a yes.
That's
a hard
yes.
Well, thank you, everybody.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Bell Lago
much.
too for the wine. Appreciate it.
Yes.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.